Hello, welcome to my how to build a dinosaur tutorial. This is going to be a series of videos that's going to show you how to create a dinosaur. This first video, I'm just going to show you the pieces and parts you need to start with. This is the little dinosaur we are going to make. He ends up being about 6 inches tall when we are finished. For our list of supplies, we have yarn, obviously. Now I am using big twist yarn. It is size 5 yarn. You can use any size 5 yarn you like, but I'm choosing to use this because it comes in some really fun dinosaur colors. You will need a scrap piece of yarn, probably a foot long. I've got 2 feet here. I'm using black, and this is to do the eyes. If you want to do mouth, eyebrows, anything else on the face, you can certainly do that. The reason I use yarn instead of plastic eyes is because when you have little kids, if they pull on the eyes, sometimes they can work it out from the stitching. So I prefer to use yarn for eyes and just embroider them on the top. You'll need stuffing. And for this, I used just some kind of batting stuffing that I had left over from another project. You can use old socks, especially if you have little kid socks. Those are good for that. If you have old dish rags or things that you want to use, that works as well. You just need some kind of batting or stuffing. You need a hook. The hook I'm using is a 7mm hook, a yarn needle, and that's how I am attaching all these pieces together, so I definitely need one of these. I also want stitch markers, and the stitch markers I prefer have these bumps, and that allows me to loop it through the row and not necessarily have to clip it every time. The good thing about doing that is, especially when I'm doing small things like his arms, if I have to clip it every time, it just seems to slow me down a lot and it gets kind of frustrating. So I like the ones with the little bumps because it will hold it in place. And then lastly, I always use sticky notes on my patterns so that when I'm working from a pattern, I can move it down the pattern as I go rather than marking up my pattern. Now, let me give you some notes on how we're going to create this guy. So first of all, like I mentioned, we're going to create him in parts. So we'll create his head first, then his body, then his tail, then his arms and legs and all these little spikes. When I crochet a stuffed animal, there's a couple things that I do a little differently than I think a lot of people do. One is I like to go through both loops of the stitch below. So the reason I do that is you don't end up with those stripes that you do if you do a single crochet. Usually you end up with a kind of a ridge around. I prefer it without that because it makes it look a little more consistent and flatter. I will also, once I finish the head and the body, I will attach those together and usually start his face. Just because I like to have a personality of the animal before I start to add arms and tail and everything else onto it. I kind of like to see that face come to life. So I will put those together pretty quickly. The stitches we use for this is we will use a slip stitch, a single, a chain, and then a single crochet. If you don't know how to do a single crochet and you're not very familiar with that stitch, I really encourage you to watch a single crochet video. I happen to have one, and practice that stitch for a while because it's easier to do when you're in a flat row than it is when you're building an animal and you're going around in circles. You kind of tend to lose your place if you're new at it. So I really prefer that you kind of have a little bit of a foundation on that. So I would take some scrap yarn or even your project yarn if you want and kind of practice that single crochet for a minute before you embark on Mr. Dinosaur. All right, so I will meet you over in the next video where we will talk about creating his head.